Feel like, wow, the hallway conversations are better than the panels. They're not. They're equally good, but the panels are great. So it is my pleasure to moderate this panel, the title of which is Welfare, Workfare, and Criminalization. I'm Claire Pastori. I'm on the faculty here at USC Law, and I teach poverty law, suing the government, the access to justice practicum, and other such rabble-rousing things. Before coming to teach full-time, I spent 15 years as an attorney at the Western Center on Law and Poverty, and a few years at the ACLU, litigating and advocating on economic justice issues, and in particular on public benefits issues, welfare, the maximum family grant, all kinds of issues that we've been talking about today. So I'm very excited to be moderating this panel and to be at this conference, and I join everyone in thanking Camille for pulling it all together. It's fantastic. I have found it interesting as well for the little intermittent personal notes, and as another person who grew up in a very poor household and has some very racialized way that was understood in my family, I look forward to those informal conversations, perhaps over lunch or at other sessions with people as well, but it's been extremely interesting. So let me introduce the panelists for this panel, and I'm very excited to be the moderator, both because we have such a wonderful and provocative and distinguished panel, but also because every one of the panelists has had a substantial experience as a public interest lawyer, and so I just really like that crossover of actual practice, integration and engagement with the issues that we're talking about, and then bringing it into the academic setting and thinking about a scholarly focus on it. So I like that we all share that in common. So we are not speaking in the order in which we're sitting. Anne will go first, then Priscilla, then Noah, then Priscilla, then Leticia. So we're a little bit out of order, but I suspect everyone will be able to follow nonetheless. So let me introduce the panelists in the order in which they will be speaking. Anne Cammett is Professor of Law and Director of the Family Law Concentration at the City University of New York School of Law. I'm going to cut short a little bit the introductions that I was going to do because we're running a little behind schedule, but I think folks have the bios in the packet, correct? So we don't need a whole lot about that. Anne's scholarship explores intersectional issues of race, gender, poverty, and mass criminalization and the family, all topics directly related to what we're doing today. Her work as an advocate includes stints at New York Legal Aid and the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, and she'll be reflecting today on the resonance between some of her earlier work explicitly on welfare queens and deadbeat dads, how metaphor shapes poverty law, and a new piece called Welfare Reform, the Epilogue, Criminalizing Mothers in an Age of Neoliberalism. Our second panelist, we decided that Noah is our second panelist. Is that so? Is that correct? Noah Zatz is Professor of Law at UCLA, and his work is primarily around employment and labor law, welfare and anti-poverty policy, work and family issues, and feminist legal and social theory. His primary focus is on which activities become recognized and protected as work, and he's done a lot of work that I've drawn personally on in teaching and in other ways on the Earned Income Tax Credit, and I don't know if you'll be talking about that today, but I think there's some very interesting things about how that has now eclipsed welfare as the largest single income support program for low-income people, and of course it's only for people who work, so there's a lot of resonance there about the topics that we're talking about today. Noah's practice experience includes a Skadden Fellowship at the National Employment Law Project in New York City, representing low-income individuals and community organizations on low-wage workforce issues. Noah's comments today will be drawn from his work, precarious work in the carceral state, talking about links between work requirements in welfare and the criminal justice system. Our third panelist is Priscilla Osen, who's Associate Professor of Law here in Los Angeles at Loyola Law School, where she teaches criminal law, family law, and a seminar on race, gender, and the law. And her work primarily examines the relationship between race and gender identities and punishment. And let's see, Priscilla was a Thurgood Marshall Fellow at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of the San Francisco Bay Area, working on voting rights, police misconduct, and conditions of confinement in women's prisons. And my understanding is that her comments are coming from her new piece, The New Racially Restrictive Covenant, Race, Welfare, and the Policing of Black Women in Public Housing. And then last but certainly not least, Leticia Salcedo is Professor of Law and Director of Clinical Education at UC Davis, and she's an expert in employment, labor, and immigration law. She had previously worked at MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, as well as a little bit in the private sector, and her work focuses on intersections of employment, labor, and immigration law, and I think she'll take this panel in a very, and perhaps this whole conference in a very interesting direction as our final panelist in talking about how immigrants have been incorporated into the welfare queen narrative, giving states the liberty to criminalize their entry into the labor market. So I hope you all are as excited about this panel as I am, and I will turn it over to Anne for our first presentation.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you so much, Camille, and the organizers for inviting me. This is a really unique opportunity, actually, to posit the notion of the welfare queen prospectively, not retrospectively, in the way that we tend to think of the welfare queen as having driven so much social policy. And I hadn't really thought about it that way until I got the invitation and thought about, well, you know, what does a welfare queen look like now, and how is she operationalized in neoliberalism today, post-welfare? So I'm going to pick up on a lot of things that panelists have said and take some in a deeper direction. But I also want to think about the welfare queen not as a static representation of a demonized woman and an icon of revulsion, right? But to capture her meaning and purpose in a fully realized neoliberal state, which is where I think we are today, and I think that's part of my ongoing project. So I want to ask some different questions and surface some different connections, including my work in family law, which is really the crux of what I do. So again, like I just suggested, how does the construct of the welfare queen have continuing resonance in the production of thought and policy that informs our notion of entitlement in an age of neoliberalism? Who has access to the social compact and who is excluded? What happens to low or no income women of color portends the fate of all of us, right? And just to pick up on Michelle Goodwin's point about the welfare queen being the canary in the coal mine, I want to borrow that from Lonnie Guinier and situate my comments there. So last year, I published an article entitled "Deadbeat Dads and Welfare Queens: How Metaphor Shapes Poverty Law." And to some degree, that article was intended to be retrospective, and it was for a symposium that actually analyzed the impact of the war on poverty on the occasion of the 50th anniversary. And as I researched and wrote the paper, I detailed the ways in which policymakers have historically traded on the demonization of poor women, particularly poor African American women in this country, and continuously throughout our history. But I want to remind people that the end goal of all that, really, from small government proponents, right, was always to eradicate the social safety net for everyone, right? So it's like a three-card Monty. You know, we're showing you these poor black girls over here, but we're robbing you blind, you know, while you're not looking, right? And that's the nature of America. And we see that even with our president, you know, in terms of what he proffers and how he's so responsive to these critiques, because they're so built into our culture. So there was more to that paper, and actually I'll talk a little bit about it this afternoon in the last panel, which I think will be useful in terms of talking about child support at this moment in our history, right? But for the purposes of this project, I looked at the construct of the welfare queen prospectively. And if our project here is to look at systems to surface institutional norms that are created from this construct, we should recognize that we should track these women from the status of welfare recipients to the status of low-wage workers or survivalists, right? And that's much to what Michelle was talking about earlier, and the ways in which neoliberalism is operationalized. So here's where I define neoliberalism differently, perhaps. In addition to what the supporters call extensive economic deregulation, free trade, reductions in government spending in order to enhance the role of a private sector in the economy, I also include the buttressing of mass criminalization, right? Both in symbolic ways and in practical ways. So there's a way in which the criminal justice system has now spread out throughout a variety of agencies to do the work, right, of the economic order. So to that end, that is my project, Criminalizing Mothers in the Age of Neoliberalism. I want to start out with some real faces, and I think sometimes we miss the people in this discourse, right? You may have seen many of these faces on the news, and these stories come up, but I think that these stories are really driven and motivated by a discourse around poverty and criminalization that I want to track together under one rubric. So here's Shanisha Taylor, right? She's an Arizona mother, and she was arrested on child abuse charges, leaving her kids locked in a hot car when she went on a job interview after her child care fell through, right? And you may have seen her. Her mugshot here is horrible. She's crying. And she generated quite a bit of support, but not so much that they didn't actually prosecute her, right? Here we have Deborah Harrell, a South Carolina mother who was charged with child abuse when she let her 9-year-old child play in the park while she was working as a shift manager at McDonald's. She too had child care issues, and the reason she left the child in the park was because she knew that there was a woman there who was actually giving out food for the poor and that she would be taken care of. She had I think it was a laptop that she kept in McDonald's and brought the child there when her child care fell through, except that her house had been broken into a couple of weeks before and it was stolen, and she didn't feel like the child could sit inside all day. Somebody saw the child in the park, called the police, she was arrested, the child was taken into the child welfare system. Here we have Eileen Danino, a Pennsylvania mother of 7 who died from high blood pressure complications in a jail cell where she was serving a 2-day sentence for her children's truancy. So she had 7 children, no husband, and was considered white trash, as we like to say, which is awful because the sentence itself was determined so that she could actually work off $2,000 in fines for the truancy itself. In the middle of that, she actually had a heart attack and died. Finally, I introduce you to Tanya McDowell. She's a homeless Connecticut mother who was accused of sending her child to a school that is outside of her home district in Bridgeport. Right? She pleaded guilty to fraudulently enrolling her son in a school in the Norwalk district and stealing $15,000 worth of educational services, and in the process got a 5-year sentence for larceny. I should also mention too that she was homeless, and as she was trying to earn money by selling marijuana, she got caught by the police while she was out on bail and got a 12-year sentence to serve consecutively with that. All right. So what I want to suggest is that the welfare queen is a public marker of a fully realized neoliberal state, right? How these things can actually happen, it really says a lot about where we're moving and what we have been willing to tolerate thus far, right? And so what's obvious is that nearly 20 years after welfare reform, there is no longer a social safety net at all. Time limits on reduced benefits, family caps, restricted access means that survival is predicated on low-wage work. But actually, what does that mean? Three things, and I'll have to get through them in how many minutes? 5. Okay. All right. Welfare reform, wealth transfer on an enormous scale, right? A gendered intersectional analysis of the carceral state, and carceral debt schemes that serve as a privatized cost recovery. These are the aspects of the neoliberal paradigm that I want to talk about in 5 minutes. Okay. All right. So welfare is not reformed, people. It's just corporatized, right? The idea is that there is a huge transfer of economic wealth to corporations, right, who now hire low-wage workers. We know that, right? So marginal workers equals corporate welfare. Rather than give it directly to people, they give it to corporations to supplement their income because they're not earning a living wage, right? And it's interesting to note that Workfare programs actually originally displaced organized worker classes in cities like New York, right? So in other words, people who had unionized jobs were let go so that welfare workers could work there, right? But we have to note that 52% of fast food workers are actually enrolled in one or more public assistance programs, right? And 25% of all workers in this country are. Right? So this is an enormous expenditure. So here we have Deborah Harrell again, right, who could not afford childcare simply because she worked at McDonald's. All right? Similarly, the child care paradigm is also privatized. If you haven't noticed, people who can afford child care have child care. Other people get caught in this web. What What I really want to talk about and what I want to leave you with is the carceral state, which we know is racialized, but it's also gendered in ways that we don't usually talk about. And that's what I want the bulk of my remaining comments to be. All right, so we know that the criminal courts, right, and the prison industrial complex is highly gendered as male, right? So we think about incarceration, we think about men. But in fact, in the way that we talk about women in the criminal justice system is that women are now the fastest growing members of the criminal justice system. But I actually want to talk about women in the carceral state very differently, right? Men go into the criminal justice system through the criminal courts, but women go into the criminal justice system through the child welfare courts, just like the women that I showed you. And so I want to suggest that there's a nexus between the child welfare courts and the criminal justice system that is quite direct, which we don't often talk about. And so the family courts, which are designed to support children, are actually sites of subordination and criminality for women in ways that we hardly ever talk about because we gender this question as male. The last piece of that, this neoliberal doctrine that I'm talking about, is privatized cost recovery, right? We have a carceral debt scheme, and I know some of you saw this in Ferguson, right, where the town was pretty much a cash cow, and the black residents of the town actually supported the court system through fines and fees and so forth. But this is going on all around the country. So that poor people, actually the budgets of each state are being supported on the backs of poor people through these schemes, right? And this contributes to economic inequality in a way that is also not talked about very well. Right, and just to give you some context, a 2003 report said for the Department of Justice says that nearly 25% of the entire population has a criminal record. There's 71 million criminal records in the database. And how does this manifest? Fines, penalties, user fees, child support arrears. Right? The user fees are the most interesting one because those are court-imposed financial obligations which have nothing to do with crime, right? They have to do with being processed through the criminal justice system. And I want to leave you with one example, just so that I can make this real for you. So Jane, right, is a 26-year-old woman, and this is based on a report from New York, who has 2 children, who was convicted of criminal possession of a controlled substance, which is a very common a Class A2 felony, right? She was sentenced to 7 years for a determinate sentence, and when she got out, not only did she have to pay any restitution, she had to pay a mandatory felony surcharge of $250, a crime victim assistance fee of $20, a DNA bank fee of $50, an incarceration fee of $312, a parole supervision fee of $1,800, a fee for termination of her own license suspension of $25, and child support subject to 9% interest in New York at $100 a week over 6 years of $31,000. So in some ways, I want to just conclude with this. We're thinking about the welfare queen as part of a neoliberal state. In some ways, the story of Tanya McDowell is the most troubling, right? Among a host of other stories. Tanya was arrested initially for theft of services for enrolling her child in a more affluent school district, but she's not alone. This goes on all the time. Tanya is the face of the new welfare queen. She takes what's not hers, she dips into the public coffers, and she gets none of the benefit of, let's say, Tiger Mom, right, for her efforts to obtain a decent education for her child. Why? Because her race, gender, and economic status together have branded her unworthy to access, right, just like the welfare cheat before her that Karen has talked about for so long, right? And the construct itself lives on a badge of unworthiness that's tied to mothering in the case of all these instances we talked about. Thank you.
All right, so Noah.
Let's see. Need some help with the tag. Don't expect much though. Okay. All right. So again, thanks, Camille, and to everyone here. This is really a wonderful place to be. I'm going to talk a little bit about some new work that I've begun, lots of connections actually with what Anne just talked about, not all of which I'll be able to make explicit. But this project is a kind of confluence between streams of my writing on welfare work requirements, on non-market labor other than caretaking, especially prison labor, and on the inevitable behavioral and normative content of poverty measurement. I'm going to paint with some very broad strokes and hope that is stimulating, even though I'm not going to work through a lot of the detail in the short time, and because I haven't all worked it out. At the highest level of abstraction, this project is about connecting these sort of two hands of neoliberalism that Dorothy Roberts talked about yesterday and that Anne Hammond just did now. The hand that's most discussed in circles focused on poverty and inequality is the withdrawal of the welfare state, both in the redistributive sense represented by welfare and in the regulatory sense that's represented by labor and employment law. But over the same period, right, that hand is sort of pulling state power out of the market. The other hand is bunched in a fist and reaching out in an expanding criminal justice system. And so what I want to suggest is that studying the figure of the welfare queen and all the many facets that Professor Roberts described yesterday provides important insights into the carceral state, in particular with regard to the regulation and subordination of labor. And I'm thinking about the carceral state broadly here, really in terms of the myriad forms of state violence against human bodies, including not just incarceration, but also deportation and child removal through child welfare systems. And the leading edge of all of these systems, of course, is police violence of various sorts, or its potential. And so I want to jump in with some images from counter-protests that were directed at the demonstrations following the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson and the non-indictment of Darren Wilson. And that's these images here. There we go. Okay, so the basic theme directed at the protesters was put your hands down and get a job, right? Get a job, right? Get a job is the most prominent demand issued to the welfare queen. The one-size-fits-all response to mobilization against racial and economic inequality. And that's one iteration of the recurring racist trope of the insufficiently motivated black or brown worker who needs some kind of kick in the pants or lash of the whip to do productive work, right? A trope from slavery to convict leasing to welfare reform, as Professor Briggs mentioned earlier this morning. So in a sense, get a job seems like a non sequitur in response to protest against racist police violence. But I want to explore the ways in which state violence sends and enforces that message of get a job, not just in the narrow context of prison labor, but in ways that are pervasive in low-wage labor markets and part of structuring those labor markets in racially stratified ways. So in doing this, I want to complicate some prominent lines of attack on these two hands of neoliberalism. So first, on the labor and employment law side, there's a long-running concern with deteriorating labor standards and the emergence of so-called precarious work. The dominant critique links precarious work to a neoliberal strategy of state withdrawal from effective labor market regulation, right? The state is getting out of the way and letting unfettered capitalism run amok in labor markets. So the story is one of a shrinking state, and the problem for the field is how to get the state back in. Understanding the present era as one of a shrinking state is absurd, right, to anyone who spends a moment thinking about criminal justice. But when scholars and activists focus on intersections among criminal justice, labor markets, and economic inequality, that intersection is not typically understood as one in which the criminal justice system sends and enforces the message, get a job. Indeed, that seems precisely backwards. Instead, the carceral state is more often understood as producing labor market exclusion and so-called barriers to employment. And that perspective animates Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow just as one of many examples. So her searing indictment of racialized mass incarceration is organized around the idea that, quote, it permanently locks out a huge percentage of the African American community out of the mainstream economy and society, end quote. Now, I'm no historian, but it's always struck me that this was a discordant note in the Jim Crow analogy. I've understood Jim Crow not to have been purely about exclusion and separation, but also about the incorporation to relationships of subordination. And it was in part a system of racialized labor subordination, one that simultaneously operated through exclusion from relatively good jobs and compulsion into bad ones. Compulsion operating through debt peonage, vagrancy laws, and a variety of other mechanisms. So let me get more concrete now by talking about child support enforcement. So horribly, some of my gist is captured by the recent murder of Walter Scott, who was shot in the back while fleeing a police officer in South Carolina. Scott is widely thought to have been fleeing a warrant originating in the non-payment of child support. So the state was telling Scott to get a job or go to jail, and when he tried to escape the double bind, the state killed him. And as this crowd knows, child support enforcement is deeply intertwined with the history and institutions of welfare, the privatization of dependency, and the behavioral control of poor women of color. And although the system is organized and around and justified by the figure of the deadbeat dad, who has a steady income but refuses to share it with his children, we know that the middle-class divorce story there has little relevance to non-custodial parents of low-income kids, where typically both custodial and non-custodial parents have very limited job prospects. The dominant issue is not one of inadequate sharing of earnings, but inadequate earnings to share. And this immediately puts the focus on work behavior. Once attention turns to the work patterns of non-custodial parents, you can pretty much recycle the usual positions with regard to welfare work requirements, including their racial politics. So Lawrence Mead, sadly familiar to many of us, has seamlessly transferred his arguments for mandatory work-first programs in welfare into arguments for mandatory work-first programs aimed at non-custodial parents. Mead argues that, quote, raising poor men's work levels, like welfare mothers, will require some combination of help and hassle. Even when opportunities are improved, a disorderly lifestyle must still be curbed before these men can take hold in the labor market and advance. So obligations to work, not just better chances, appear indispensable, end quote. Now this is where the carceral state comes in. In the child support context, the state is trying to get non-custodial parents to pay money to the state, not vice versa. So the state can't threaten to withhold payments as leverage to enforce work as it does in the welfare context. Fortunately for Mead, we have debtors' prisons. So because child support obligations arise from orders of a family court judge, they can be enforced in contempt proceedings, and one sanction for civil contempt is incarceration. And you can get to the same place more directly through the criminalization of non-payment of child support as a freestanding offense. Now, it's still unconstitutional on the books, they say, to jail someone just for being poor. So the bare fact of non-payment can't legally be the basis for either contempt or conviction. Instead, the touchstone is willful non-payment. But what does willful non-payment mean? It certainly means something more robust than simply having money in the bank but refusing to write the check. Instead, it also includes the willful failure to acquire money in the first place. And so the practical content of inability to pay turns out to be inability to work or to work enough. And if someone is willfully not working, then they are willfully not paying. But if their unemployment is involuntary, then there is no willful non-compliance. And so this is the point at which the boundary between financial and behavioral considerations becomes completely porous, just as they do in the means testing context. And that's something I've written about elsewhere at length. So drawing lines between voluntary and involuntary unemployment is the bread and butter of the welfare state, the basis to pay or not to pay. And so here we see that same line being drawn by the carceral state now as the basis to jail or not to jail. Having arrived at this classic issue in the welfare literature and policy world, I just want to telegraph several connections between the welfare context and this carceral context without going into them in depth in the interest of time. So first, we see the growing replication in the child support enforcement context of work programs that were developed as models to enforce welfare work requirements and now being transferred into child support enforcement by people like Mead and also by the Obama administration. Second, these work tests are always about which jobs to take, not just about job or no job. You always have to decide which jobs you must seek and accept and which you can turn down. Third, issues of discretion are paramount, except now the street-level bureaucrats are in the child support agency or in the probation department, not necessarily welfare. Fourth, what happens to those who are subjected to work requirements is intertwined with the whole labor market. So for instance, unpaid community service or work experience was a mainstay of welfare reform. It was used not only to discipline those who claimed involuntary unemployment, but also to discipline public sector unions by replacing them with unpaid labor. So here I want to switch gears to the context of criminal justice debt from fees, fines, and restitution, where, like child support, these are court-ordered debts that can be enforced by incarceration sanctions. And again, enforcement is governed by the same willful non-payment standard, so you get the same chain from non-payment to non-work to labor standard setting that I just described in more detail on child support. And in this context of criminal justice debt, many liberals are offering unpaid community service as the progressive alternative to debtor's prison. So you get debt peonage instead of debtor's prison, and you celebrate that. And so finally, moving further into the core of the criminal justice system, note that work requirements are ubiquitous conditions of probation, parole, and other forms of community supervision. Moreover, so too is payment of child support and criminal justice debt as conditions of supervision. So unsurprisingly, Lawrence Mead is all over this, touting community supervision as an existing institution that has extensive contact with and authority over men in low-income communities of color. So Mead is advocating taking these models that were started in welfare, adapted to the child support context, and now incorporating them into work programs that would be backed up by the threat of incarceration through revocation of probation or parole. Vice versa, even when liberals counter with robust, well-funded job creation programs, they still accept the frame of mandatory programs backed up by the threat of incarceration, as we see, for instance, in Bruce Western's work. So the debate has already narrowed to something that's roughly analogous to the range between Bill Clinton's and Newt Gingrich's first offers on welfare reform in the early 90s. So let me end by just suggesting a few ways that the welfare queen as a figure of resistance can offer some lessons from welfare rights mobilization to these new contexts. First, there's the rejection of the privatization of dependency that lies behind the child support enforcement system as it oppresses both non-custodial parents and custodial parents. Second, there's the demand for access to living wage jobs, not work first and not unpaid workfare. And third, and most ambitiously, is the demand for alternatives to market citizenship altogether, which say that even the mandatory living wage job is insufficient to our visions of justice.
Do we have the slides uploaded for Priscilla? Do we have them?
Okay. Well, while the slides are loading, first let me say thank you so much for the invitation to be here, Camille, and for bringing us all together for this rich and important conversation. So the title of my talk is Birthing Mass Incarceration, and what I want to do is to kind of discuss the way in which the welfare queen archetype and the stereotypes associated with this racialized welfare queen impact the ways in which women of color, particularly black women, are criminalized and then experience punishment within this vast carceral state. So let me start. So part of this conversation is to shift where we usually associate, the conversations about welfare queen as they're firmly implanted in the discourses around the welfare state. Noah left off by talking about, these images of Bill Clinton talking about welfare to work and signing the Welfare Reform Act with, quite conspicuously two black women by his side as if they're co-signing. You also have recent comments by Newt Gingrich, who is telling black people, what they should be demanding, right? That they should be demanding jobs and not welfare, not food stamps, right? Sort of the same, along the same lines as Noah was outlining. But I think what this panel has done so powerfully is to demonstrate the way in which the welfare queen is not only quite powerful in disciplining our imagination and disciplining social policies in the context of social welfare, but also in connecting us with the story of Michael Brown and Ferguson and police violence and mass incarceration. And so that's the title of my paper today, Birthing Mass Incarceration. And a recent Department of Justice report on the investigation of Ferguson, as Ann and Noah were just mentioning, which was prompted by the shooting death of Michael Brown, it was found that the Ferguson Police Department engaged in a pattern and practice of racial discrimination against African Americans. Obviously, the shooting death of Michael Brown is but one significant example of this ongoing pattern and practice, and the way in which Ferguson exists as a prime example of the functioning of mass incarceration, the continuing functioning of racialized mass incarceration in the United States. The report found, for example, that although roughly 67% of Ferguson's residents are African American, they made up 93% of arrests and 90% of people given citations. As part of the investigation, the Justice Department discovered and then subsequently published a series of emails. And this is where I think that I'm going to sort of draw out the connection between Ferguson mass incarceration and the welfare queen construct. There was an email that was sent around by members of the Ferguson Police Department, and it read, "An African American woman in New Orleans was admitted to the hospital for a pregnancy termination. 2 weeks later, she received a check for $5,000. She phoned the hospital to ask who it was from. The hospital said, Crime Stoppers." And this was emailed around to everyone, essentially. There was no condemnation. This was endorsed. The essential characteristics of the welfare queen are present in this joke, right? In this racist expression. She is poor, she is black, she relies on social welfare, she is unrestrained in her childbearing, she is presumably engaging in irresponsible sexual practices, she is unmarried. The presumed outcome of this is failed parenting and criminal behavior by her child. Although this is just one email, it highlights the connection between social constructs of black women's identities, black women's reproduction, social welfare, and mass incarceration. In sum, all of this is encapsulated by the welfare queen. It's used at the welfare queen construct is used as a basis to surveil, brutalize, and to lock up black women and their children. Thus black women's bodies and the meanings associated with them serve as a primary site for mass incarceration. So I really appreciated Ann's assertion that we should understand mass incarceration not only as a racialized phenomenon, but one that is deeply gendered. So how does this happen? So first, through the deployment of the welfare queen construct, black women are blamed for social problems, particularly violence and poverty. It's their choices as individuals, part of this sort of neoliberal framework that has been discussed, that their choice to have children, not to work, and not institutional racism that produce negative social outcomes. Second, through notions of fraudulence and deviance associated with the welfare queen, black women are presumed to be criminals. Thus, they experience high degrees of surveillance of their movements through public and private spaces. They not only have this experience or this presumption of criminality, but it also functions to dehumanize black women when they're incarcerated. So, for example, I'll discuss this later, the prison becomes a site of continued social welfare consumption, right? The prison is seen as social welfare, and black women are its primary consumers deliberately. And then thirdly, black women's wombs are seen as criminogenic, right? And so their children are born criminals. And so the logical conclusion from all of this to be drawn is that mass incarceration is a logical response to individual pathology that's represented by black women and the welfare queen. So first, blaming the welfare queen. So I want to show us just a couple of different images here. So black women, particularly as embodied by the welfare queen, are blamed for and punished for social disorders such as poverty, gun violence, and educational disparities. Poor black women are blamed for impoverishment in their communities. and all other kinds of, any kind of problem. You can identify it and associate it with Black women. So I just want to highlight a couple of comments here. So these are, fairly well known. The first is by William Bennett, former U.S. Secretary for Education. On his radio show, he noted that, or he argued that if you wanted to reduce crime in this country, if your sole purpose, you could abort every Black baby in this country, and your crime rate would go down, right? So this is an assumption, this is a connection between Black women's childbearing and criminality, and blaming them for a crime that is occurring. In a more recent example, here I got a picture of Mitt Romney pointing his finger at welfare mothers, at Black women, in a recent debate with President Obama as part of the 2012 campaign in response to a question about gun violence. Mitt Romney went on about single mothers, right? He's talking about what we need to do to help single mothers, and he says we can make changes in the way that our culture works. Wow, 5 minutes. In our culture works, we need to change our culture in order to help us to deal with violence. And the cultural problem, single mothers, code for Black women. And unless we think this is just a problem on the right, we also have President Obama in his signature racial justice initiative, My Brother's Keeper. The first page, when it says, "What is this about?" The quote is, "Despite areas of enormous progress in this country, the gates of opportunity have not fully opened for all in America. For decades, opportunity has lagged behind boys and young men of color. Boys are too often born into poverty and live with a single parent." Then it pivots to mentors. Right, so we jump over a huge chasm of institutional causes for the experiences of boys and men of color, let alone women of color, but that's a separate conversation. Right, so here Black women's childbearing is explicitly linked to disorder and criminality as criminogenic, right? So with this setup, mass incarceration, imprisonment becomes a very easy solution. So this is part of America's, as Anthony Farley notes, its desire for criminality, its desire for Black criminality. It gives us the justification for the construction of a carceral edifice. But this doesn't end in terms of prosecutions and surveillance and arrest. It also extends into the site of imprisonment, right? The context and the conditions of confinement that women who are incarcerated, like the ones that Ann talked about, experience while in prison. So these ideas about fraudulence and manipulativeness that are associated with the welfare queen also impact how women of color, particularly Black women, are treated once they are incarcerated. So, for example, you have Black women's character flaws, these character flaws that are associated with the welfare queen tracking and being used to justify failure to provide them medical care, for example, and the prison being used or discussed as a site of provision of social welfare services. So here, let's see which quote is this. So here you have a guard here that basically says that, these women lack fundamental and natural maternal instincts. Something is wrong with them. They're being dehumanized here, right? This is another a stereotype that's associated with the welfare queen. This pursuit of material resources at the expense of the state, and a disregard for one's maternal role or for the well-being of one's children, right? This is being reflected here. You also have this being reflected in the comments of an administrator. Let me get here and you can just highlight the portions in red where the administrator is suggesting that pregnant women are choosing to go to prison in order to, I hope this is the quote here, that pregnant women are choosing to go to prison in order to get health care, right? That they are manipulating the system. This sort of idea of women as manipulative, as fraudulent, also appears and is used to justify the disregard and dehumanization of Black women who are pregnant. So in a case, for example, called Doe versus Gustavus, there was a pregnant woman who was, trying to notify the guards in the prison where she was being incarcerated that she was in labor. They did not believe her. They put her in an isolation cell where they denied her even the basic kinds of medical care, including pain medication. She delivered the baby herself. And once they were summoning medical care, one of the guards said to her that she pushed that baby out on purpose just to get out of segregation. right? So here you have this idea of fraudulence and malingering that's being used to justify the incarceration of pregnant women, then to deny them medical care once they're there. Let me go back to the image of the shackled woman. This is the justifications for shackling are also tied to the welfare queen, that women would use labor and childbirth as a excuse to escape, right? That this would all be manufactured. So these are just a few examples of the way that the welfare queen archetype tracks mass incarceration, right? Tracks the initial justification and the justifications for the horrible dehumanizing treatment that women experience. And just briefly with regard to my last claim, which is that it identifies their children as criminalizable and incarcerable, right? Because these children are born to women, perhaps inside or outside of prisons, that don't care about them, that lack these maternal instincts, that will manipulate their pregnancies in order to access some kind of a social benefit. Their children will simply run amok and need the supervision and surveillance and punishment of the state in order to be fully disciplined. So this is the way in which I think pregnant women particularly are constructed as part of this welfare queen frame. They're casted not as people with problems, right, but as the problem, and as a problem to be managed by the carceral state. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Thanks to Camille and to the organizers of this conference. This has been fascinating to me since I don't usually work in this field. And when Camille asked me to participate, I had to think a bit about how all this fit, because Camille always knows how things fit better than I do. But as I thought about it some more, I realized that the phenomenon of the undocumented worker and the wrongly documented worker, which I had already been working on, is very much related to the welfare reform efforts of the 1990s, and is in fact historically has been the making of the undocumented worker has historically been the other side of the coin of the marginalization of blacks in the United States. So I want to do three things in this presentation as I bring these discourses together, the discourse of immigration reform and the discourse of welfare reform that was occurring in the 1990s. I want to, my thesis is this, that yesterday's criminalization of poverty that produced the welfare to work legislation of the 1990s and an increased focus on fraud and fraudulent procurement of benefits has produced in large part today's criminalization of poverty. An example of which is states' efforts to criminalize the use of false Social Security numbers for work. And these welfare reform efforts of the 1990s share with today's criminalization of work by undocumented immigrants this creation of a system of inequitable social relationships and marginalization. So I want to start with a historical perspective on the development of an immigrant penal system to deal with undocumented workers, at the same time as parallel vagrancy statutes were being used and Jim Crow laws were being used to do the same thing with the African American population. And then I want to move to a description of the 1990s legislation and connections between welfare reform and increasingly restrictive sets of immigration laws at the same time that criminalize things like welfare fraud for immigrants. And then I want to talk about, lastly, state efforts to criminalize the false use of Social Security numbers for work, which is where we've gotten to today, as the final attempt, I think, to circumscribe work that immigrants do in the United States. So I recently heard historian Kelly Lytle Fernandez give a presentation where she discussed her thesis that the carceral state that had developed a system for incarcerating Mexicans in the 1920s and the 1930s through the use of restrictive immigration policies and through the criminalization of entry into the United States, or legal entry or legal re-entry. And she described the system of development of labor camps that were created through this federal penal system that paralleled what was happening in state penal systems where blacks were rounded up and used as prison labor. And as a result of this labor, for example, roads in Arizona were built from Tucson up to Phoenix and that sort of thing. So this example of controlled labor through detention and then deportation has been reinvented throughout the decades. And so we had the Bracero program for a while, this system of circular migration where we use labor for a little while and then we throw it back. So I'm quoting Laila Hernandez here to summarize our state today that shows you the sort of the two sides of the same coin that we're talking about. Prisoners, parolees, and undocumented immigrants cannot vote. Parolees, felons, and undocumented immigrants are variously denied public housing, food stamps, educational loans, and employment. Prisoners, deportees, and immigrant detainees are forcibly removed from their families and communities, while undocumented immigrants, parolees, and persons under warrant live with the constant fear of arrest. So the story that starts with this incarceration and eventual deportation of Latinos in the 1930s for violations of vagrancy and other public order laws serves as the baseline for thinking about how immigration and criminal laws have created the structures behind an integrated system of laws that ultimately protect jobs, or I should say the good jobs, for whites. And today, these categories, the categories that are used to maintain this sort of white privilege in the workplace are defined as native-born versus foreign-born, where the native-born need protection of laws against those who are foreign-born, and the foreign-born are just as welfare recipients seen as unjustly taking something that belongs to whites. So I'm going to fast forward now to the 1990s legislation. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act was passed about a month before the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. So same Congress, same narratives were going on that produced highly, highly restrictive controls over these two sets of populations. The narratives that perpetuated the welfare queen also perpetuated the images that Camille talked about yesterday of illegal aliens crossing the border to have anchor babies and to take advantage of the welfare system. So as a result of these two sets of legislation, immigrants, legal immigrants, all immigrants, including legal immigrants and lawful permanent residents, were removed from any kind of benefit system that existed at the time. So they were not eligible for SSI, Social Security, any sort of benefits. So the welfare queen sort of narrative was reinterpreted to look brown and immigrant. And there were these two sorts of narratives that were going on. One was the anchor baby narrative, and the other was this narrative of Chinese grandmothers coming to the United States based on ads that they had seen in China, where their Social Security needs would be taken care of, and they would be taken care of in old age. And so there was this narrative of Chinese kids bringing their parents over to dump them on the U.S. Social Security system. So Perara was as much about immigration reform as about welfare reform. Immigrants were demarcated as outsiders who had to find private ways to support their families. And so you start to get all of the restrictive ways in which people could work in the United States. Half of the budgetary savings from Perara came from the exclusion of benefits to immigrants. And again, non-citizens were not just barred from things like Social Security, but states were then given the option to deny benefits to non-citizens. In other words, this welfare queen narrative was used not just in the service of marginalizing black mothers, it was reinterpreted and used in the immigration context to exclude immigrants virtually completely from any kind of benefit system. So now, the labor flow is regulated through a combination of policies that restrict immigrant access to benefits, but also to work, and this is what I'm going to get to. It started pretty much in 1996. You start to see the circular, we've used the labor, now we want to send it back through deportation policies. And here, the chart that I'm showing you, that extreme increase in deportation that that exist up until today, that's 2012 numbers, but that chart is still going up, starts in around 1997 when these two laws were put into place. And it wasn't just, the deportations that I'm showing here are not just deportations across the board, they're targeted. They're targeted Mexicans and Central Americans. So that green line at the top is Mexicans, and then the blue line that you see there is Central Americans, and then everybody else is sort of down at the bottom, pretty much stable all the way across. The chart that I'm not going to put up that I can show you shows that it's actually that green and that blue are Mexican and Central American men, and women stayed at that same level at the bottom. I'm not sure what to make of that, and that's why I didn't put the chart in there, but I just thought I'd mention that. The other big change was there was a change in apprehensions from the border to the interior. And so you start seeing in 2008, 50% of apprehensions now of immigrants are in the interior of the United States. And that has sort of continued. It's about 50% that goes throughout. So why is this important? Because it signals state involvement, not just now in welfare policies, but in criminalizing the presence of the undocumented. So there's this whole federal system that during the Bush administration depended on state cooperation to jail, detain, and then be able to deport immigrants. And all of this was coming from, a lot of it was coming from state enforcement. So these interior enforcement policies then coincided with state criminalization efforts. And what we end up seeing then is the tax-paying citizen that we've been talking about versus the non-citizen and the welfare recipient. In other words, the American worker versus the undocumented worker. So what I've been studying is state identity theft statutes. Now, we all, like, who's against identity theft, right? I mean, who's going to be against laws that capture people who use somebody else's identity? So 11 states have passed identity theft laws that include the use of false numbers, social security numbers, for work. Another 10 states have interpreted general identity theft statutes to include false identity for work. And I'm showing you there an example. That what it means is willfully and fraudulently using counterfeit or fictitious identifying information concerning a real, fictitious, or deceased person with the intent to use counterfeit or fictitious identifying information for the purpose of obtaining work. Who does that? Undocumented workers, right? It's very specifically aimed, and it is aimed in the statutes and the legislation at those folks. So of the 11 states that have passed these, all of them passed anti-immigration statutes and passed or considered them. So if we view these ahistorically, they make sense, right? Because who's not against identity theft? But when we view it in this context of history, the laws reveal their racialized targets. The demographics of the 11 states that passed them all saw an increase in the Latino population in the last decade, and all but 2 experienced a 75% increase in the population. All right, so what are the assumptions here? The assumptions about that are behind these statutes are that jobs belong to whites, and I should say good jobs belong to whites, that immigrants are illegally taking these jobs, and that criminalizing this illegal usurpation will right the wrong. So most important of all of this is that criminalization now both of welfare fraud and identity theft are moral judgments about the character of both undocumented immigrants and welfare recipients, and at the same time about the moral superiority and entitlement of whites to these jobs. And the moral judgment, which is codified in these state criminal laws, perpetuates attitudes about white entitlement to jobs, but also the narratives about how undocumented immigrants and welfare abusers are specially treated when governments don't go after them. All right, so what's wrong with these assumptions? To me, the striking thing, so they're striking in their blindness. I also teach employment law, right? They're striking in their blindness to the fact that we live in an at-will regime where employers can hire and fire at will, and most of these states are also right-to-work states. So, but they also ignore employer agency or preference in creating the jobs that nobody else will take, and in filling those jobs with undocumented workers. And it plays into this argument of employers that they don't knowingly hire these workers. All right, I'm running out of time. So we've talked a lot about reframing the problem, and so this is where I want to take us now. And so, there you go. There's three aspects of the problem of exclusion in the workplace through these identity theft laws that I think require reframing. First, I think we need to focus the discussion on employer structures that create the jobs that nobody else will take. And second, as Professor Hancock alluded to, we need to find interest convergence in targeting those employers who create the low-wage jobs that don't have benefits or access to upward mobility. And in making the connections between immigration reform and welfare reform, I think we unearth the ways in which this neoliberal ideology of privatization is itself a construct. It's a construct, right? And the narrative is not an inclusive one. So this construct of equal citizenship through paid labor is also one that leaves out welfare recipients on the one hand, and then undocumented workers on the other, because now there's a legal construct that leaves out a whole population based on sort of laws that were created that make a worker an undesirable worker. So equal citizenship, in other words, has two aspects of inclusion. Exclusion from equality to the extent that someone's not in the paid labor force, and exclusion from citizenship, even if one is in the paid labor force, as I've shown in my example. So I think third, we need to remake or re-scramble these categories so that the legal constructions don't fit so neatly and they don't make sense. So this is one sort of nod in that area. In the immigration reform movement, in the immigrants' rights movement, it's pretty much fueled by youth today, by the Dreamers and the DACA recipients, who are claiming their status as undocumented and then seeking rights based on that status, right? So the implementation of Obama's Deferred Action Plan creates a situation in which approximately 5 million undocumented workers will now have work authorization and valid Social Security numbers, even though they're undocumented, right? So this is an example of this scrambling of the legal constructions that disrupt the current paradigms of exclusion that exist, at least in this one category. So I'm going to stop now because I think I've run out of time, but I look forward to the discussion.
So thank you all panelists for such wonderful remarks. I have one or two things that I'd like to take my moderator prerogative and say, and then we'll, I think, still have a little time for questions, right? So I'm struck by what a good resonance this panel had with the title of this conference, because the conference, of course, is called Reframing the Welfare Queen, and I feel like this panel really took us on the trajectory of the sort of behavioral to character-driven aspects of the welfare queen and the corresponding changes in welfare policy. I'm often, when I teach poverty law, I think I talk to students about the what used to be the preface to the AFDC law, which said the purpose of AFDC is to provide benefits for families and encourage work to the maximum extent possible consistent with family life and family well-being, or something like that. So it was keep families together, encourage work, but recognizing that there are limits on the amount of work which it is reasonable to encourage. And of course, the preamble and the statement of purpose for TANF, the 96 welfare law that we have now, says the purpose of this is to end this program. The purpose of this is to end dependence on benefits and get people to work.
And get married.
And get married, yes, yes. And it feels as though what President Clinton said in signing the TANF reform was, we've ended the ability to criticize people on public benefits because we've turned them into workers. And that the sort of cardinal importance of work, and I think about Joel Handler's work on how the central question of American social welfare policy is who is morally excused from work. And we've decided virtually no one is morally excused from work. And so the stated intent of the 96 reform was in part to bring these moms off the couch into the workplace, and now they could no longer be morally criticized as non-workers. But now it seems they're being criticized in ways that are not entirely new. They certainly were parts of the picture before, but as criminals themselves, or the breeders of criminals, and the fraudsters, and those in need of an ever more intrusive surveillance state. So I'm quite struck by how well those narratives played in all of the comments that you had, and especially then Leticia bringing that into, now we look at the immigrant for whom work is not the solution but the problem, and that's an enormous social problem that we need to deal with. So I guess that's really not so much a question as a statement, just to say that I just really appreciate this panel, and I don't know if any of you would like to comment on whether you agree with me that we've moved from a central conception of the welfare queen as someone whose biggest problem for us, the taxpayers, us, the responsible citizens, and perhaps us white citizens, is someone who refuses to work, and now we look at a more character-driven breeder of criminals, committer of fraud, someone in need of surveillance. I'm curious about whether you agree with me that we've shifted, that has reframed the welfare queen in some ways.
Yes.
Yes.
All right then.
You want to pass?
Sure.
So I mean, I really appreciate this point, in particular inspired, Leticia, by your point about the workers who aren't workers. So I mean, to my mind, that's a really important insight. When I started out in this area, doing work representing women who were in Workfare programs, right, unpaid work experience as a condition of receiving benefits, the thing that we were working on was the fact that work was not recognized as employment, and it wasn't treated with labor and employment protections, and it wasn't even called work in a sense by the state. And so that moment has really stuck with me, right? So a long-standing strategy of progressive advocacy in the area has been to call people workers, right? So, and you see this in the immigration context too, right? It's not, it's not aliens, it's workers, right? And so I've always been worried, right? And then the same thing with caregiving, right? Caregiving is work. Inmates are workers. That strategy of calling people workers has always been about placing faith in the truth of the idea that once you're really a worker, then you become respected and incorporated. And so one of the things that I think we see in a lot of the different comments on the panel is the way in which that's just not true, right? The same things that get people called not workers in the first place means that even when they're called workers, they're not the right kind of workers. And that, I mean, that to me is a deep point about the way in which race and gender operates in these systems.
So I think that's a really important point, particularly the notion that child rearing is work, right? But that child rearing is work that only a few people get credit for, right? So it's really important to remember that there are historical antecedents to all of this for slave women, right? Slave women never had those prerogatives, and after the Civil War, in fact, they derived their citizenship from their husbands, right? Except that they always had to work as well. Right, and this, in fact, worked against them in the turn of the century after the New Deal was struck, theoretically, right, which should have actually allowed, through mothers' pensions, black women to get the same prerogatives, but in fact did not. So I guess I'm suggesting that the criminalization of mothers, as it turns out to be right now, according to my own claim here, is sort of a natural result of our history, right, and the way that the idea of mothering, right, and mothering deficits as part of the design and description, right, of black women carries forth into a society that is now overly punitive and based around criminalization. So it's sort of a natural trajectory to think that that is part of the identity of the welfare queen, because that is where we live in the 21st century in America. But the idea of having maternal deficits and creating, children that are going to perpetuate crime is not a new one, and it is one that has had tremendous power in narrative in this country.
Did you, Camille, want to?
I feel bad because I'm the convener, but I have a question, so.
Do you want to take the mic, or?
Sure, I'll do.
So this just occurred to me as you were talking about the
changes have been made that have made it more difficult for immigrants to get proper documentation and have the right to work. And the construction of work opportunity as a right or a privilege, that you actually have to be a citizen or in the right category in order to even access. And I'm wondering if that kind of tension, if that kind of challenge that immigrants face sort of creates a kind of identity that puts them in opposition with, let's say, African Americans or other poor Americans in the United States that have automatic access to that benefit. So I'm wondering if there's sort of like some sort of strategic and diabolical aspect to all of this, which actually pits poor workers against each other, because some are seen as not even appreciating their right or privilege to access all of these poor and terrible condition jobs, and others are seen as unfairly infiltrating that category. I'm wondering if that has any resonance for you, if that seems to be part of the narrative, and if you've seen it sort of play out in any of these policy discussions.
So I think Robin Lenhart's here, and she can talk about it better than I can. But I think that's exactly right. I think that's what I was getting at when I said we need to focus on employer structures that create these kinds of jobs, right? And create the interest convergence between poor blacks and whites and poor Latinos who are all competing for these same horrible jobs, right? And I think that's exactly that, and that's why I say that immigration reform in the 1980s is the other side of the coin of welfare reform. And I don't know that it was diabolical. I mean, I don't know if it was intentional, but it worked fabulously if it was, because I think that's because you see that, right? You see communities accept the character that is coming down from these kinds of laws, whether they be breeders of criminal kind of laws or people who are fraudulent because people who commit fraud, a felony because they take a job, right, without documents.
Well, and it's almost like a hydraulic effect where you eject certain people out of the country in order to create this sort of need for employment by employers. They're willing to hire people they might not ordinarily, and then you drive wages down and you force people, poor people to work.
Well, by employers who are going to keep a job structured in such a way, I mean, just keep it like a not good job, right? That's what we have with farm workers all over California. Growers want them to be seasonal, low paid, jobs with no benefits, and they want people to go back home, and then we'll call you back in another 6 months or whatever, right? That works much better for them than people who are residents in the United States.
One of the things I think that was triggered by your question, Camille, is actually maybe a conversation that you two are having. And one of the things that's interesting about the anti-mass incarceration or movements as contrasted to the immigrants' rights movements is the way in which the worker is contrasted with the criminal, right? And I think it's really interesting the conversation that you all are having in the way in which the immigration system and the criminal justice system are reinforcing worker marginality and then punishing workers or folks that we would call workers, right, under this sort of aspirational identity for working. And in the ways that Karen Gustafson has talked about, punishing women who are receiving social welfare, putting them in impossible situations where they have to obtain sources of income outside of social welfare, and then punishing them for providing for their children, placing them in prisons where they're subjected to increasingly dehumanizing conditions of confinement, and further punishing them because they're away from their children, right, and reinforcing their dehumanization that way. So I guess this goes back to your earlier point about how work or the failure to work is situated in the neo-welfare queen, I guess. I think it's still very prominent, but none of it makes any sense, right? It's all contradictory. Right. So there's, at once you're working too much, you're working too little, it really, none of it makes sense.
Just something I wanted to add on the interest convergence point in particular is that part of what motivates the project that I'm doing is thinking about ways in which the really vibrant immigrants' rights movement should care about mass incarceration, and vice versa, looking at the ways in which the movement against mass incarceration should think about labor and workplace rights. And so even though the official messages are kind of the opposite, right? One is a get a job, the other is don't take the jobs, right? If you think about it from the perspective of employer power,
Yeah.
right? There's an incredible similarity, right? So everyone who does immigrant worker rights knows that the threat of deportation provides employers leverage over workers, whether it's through the expiration of the employer-based status of a guest worker visa or the threat of deportation from calling ICE. And so part of what I'm sort of interested in figuring out is the way in which the threat of calling the probation officer, right, the threat of calling child support can serve a similar function in those contexts and provides the basis for political solidarity.
So I think I just want to add to that one of the side effects of having a criminal conviction, right, is that you are automatically part of a class of excluded workers, right? So that it might be useful in terms of the solidarity movement to see that as a discrete group that should build alliances with immigrants and other workers.
And that's happening to some extent with the Ban the Box
Yes.
work on that. Other questions? Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful panel, and I wanted to touch back on something that was an issue that was raised in the prior panel about linguistics and about basically cognitive bias, and pick up on a point with Shanisa Taylor's her unfortunate story, and to bring out a comparison to that, right? Because it reflects what we see and what we don't see. So at the very same time that she's being prosecuted, in the very county that she was being prosecuted for 2 felonies, and where the prosecutors refused to drop, there was another case at the same time, which some of you may remember. And it was the case of Catalina Klauser, a young white mother, same county, same time, who forgot her 2-month-old infant on the roof of her car, driving 12 miles while under the influence of illegal drugs. Unbeknownst to Klauser, her child fell off the car and was found in the middle of the expressway. She will not be incarcerated, right? So how we look at statistics, like who's doing what, the prosecutor said, she's not going to be incarcerated, right? She could just be at home and get over it, right? So in terms of what it is that we think, who commits what, we're looking at statistics that don't really tell the full story. They don't tell us about who gets warned, who gets pat on the back, who gets driven home as a teenager after being engaged in kind of raucous activities and so forth. And I wondered if the panel might want to pick up on that, what we see and yet also what it is that we don't see, and how that in itself informs what the public thinks about these issues.
Well, I mean, history is replete with, examples of differential treatment. I mean, when you think about criminalizing mothers, think about, I think it was Susan Smith who drowned all of her children. And evokes such sympathy, right? Because she had postpartum, and she avoided the death penalty and all of that. I mean, I'm not pro-death penalty, so I'm glad. But the idea is that it's the narrative that is spun out about who deserves to have sympathy and empathy and who does not. And the interesting thing about Shanisa Taylor is that it should remind us that, family courts and criminal courts have concurrent jurisdiction over matters of child removal, right? That's to say that if a child really is in danger, we can remove that child and remedy the situation without sending people to prison. What you're talking about is a matter of judicial discretion. Who gets criminalized for the same activity and who does not? Who has their voice heard in child welfare court and not criminal court, and who has to be subject to both?
Yeah, I think also what you're reflecting on, obviously, is the language you use, the hypervisibility of Black women's status in society as they move through public and private spaces, right? So as Black women are hyper visible, they become hyper targets for criminalization. They become hyper targets for victimization, right? So while while criminal conduct is hyper visible and hyper regulated, their victimization is entirely invisible. We don't allow for moments of empathy. right? But I think also what's at play is a cognitive dissonance, right? Where the frame is predetermining the outcome, right? Because we see Black women as inherently deviant and as inherently criminal. That's where they are categorized based on the same conduct, right? Because it is consistent with the frame. Whereas white women's conduct, even if it's identical or worse, is inconsistent with that frame and is therefore directed out. And that reinforcement of that hyper-visibility reinforces the categorization and the frame itself. So there's this feedback loop that's occurring based on the hyper-visibility of Black women, Black girls, and Black children and their relationship to the state.
Yeah, and I think the same thing is happening with undocumented workers, right? The statutes that are being developed are specific to a population, right? I don't know of any convictions or any prosecutions of anybody who's not, you know, an undocumented worker under the statutes that are coming up in these states.
So this is sort of one step removed, less at the level of how individuals are judged and more at the level of kind of how populations are described and imagined. So I mean, I don't want to overstate it. It's a sort of delicate point, but one of the worries that I have about the ubiquity of the focus on labor market exclusion and barriers to employment is the way in which it reinforces the idea of a non-working population and community. And right in the same way that in the welfare context, one of the things that we learned through research was that, I mean, women who were receiving public assistance were working a lot, often off the books, maybe sometimes in gray or black market occupations, and by virtue of not reporting it, that itself, right, creates its own problems of welfare fraud, et cetera. But on the other hand, it's not a story of passivity, right, and not doing anything. And so, and of course, there are also extremely important problems of exclusion and barriers. But that's why I try to think about the question of which jobs you're excluded from, not thinking about it in terms of blanket exclusion, and paying attention to the things that people are actively doing and are forced to do to get by. But it's not. But as opposed to it reinforcing images of passivity and non-engagement with work.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Sean. I'm a postdoc in the history department here. Thank you for a very informative panel and to Camille for putting everything together. I had a question about Obamacare, reframing the welfare queen, which seems to be an important plank of the conference, and how it might fit into your individual papers. And so there are a bunch of narratives around Obamacare, and this is not an exhaustive list, but some people see it as like a genuine strengthening of the safety net. Some people see it as really an issue of interest convergence, and an issue of interest convergence with strengthening the safety net as a kind of secondary objective. Or some people see it as kind of neoliberalism as usual, and kind of capitulation to private markets. And so I'm wondering, for instance, in the instance of Noah's paper, one might see a story of Obamacare and neoliberalism as, okay, we're providing more health care, and so you continue to take these crappy low-wage jobs. Or some people might see it as an instance of, some employers are not going to provide health care, they'll pay the fee, or there's an issue of certain workers not being covered under Obamacare. Or in the instance of Priscilla's paper, some people see Obamacare's coverage of people with mental illnesses as something that might plug mass incarceration. But there's also a story, and I'm thinking here about like Kiera Bridges' work, about state healthcare programs really just being about continued surveillance of women of color. Mm-hmm. Or like I'm thinking about Anne and Letitia's paper in terms of undocumented immigrants and women of color. You see kind of two stories, and so the left says government largesse is really going to address fraud, where people on the right say government largesse is really going to exacerbate fraud. And so I'm really interested in thinking about how Obamacare and the ACA is fitting into your understandings of neoliberalism in your specific papers.
I think Buddy wants to. That's a great question.
Yeah.
I can start because I think mine's the easiest. Obamacare does not cover undocumented workers. And so we're back to, right? But we're back to focusing on employer structures, right? So if an employer doesn't have to worry about Obamacare because an employee who's going to complain the first thing they're going to get is they're undocumented, right? Then the employer doesn't have to worry about a fine for employers who are either working under the table or working without papers or that sort of thing. So it's sort of, it follows that neoliberal construct that I was telling you about that I was talking about the ideal worker, right? At the same time as leaving the reality of the worker who's not going to rock the boat in a position of only being able to take the jobs that these employers have created, right? So we don't get rid of the bad job or the horrible job with an Obamacare system that has said from the very beginning, we're not going to allow immigrants into that system.
I think it's the great question. At first, my answer was, well, it hasn't yet. The ACA or Obamacare hasn't figured into my thinking about the current project, but I think it's an important question. So, people have suggested that the ACA can be an important part of prison reform by providing treatment for people who are either incarcerated or by providing opportunities for treatment for people who are being diverted out the criminal justice system. I think in my basic analysis of that, I think it's a very narrow, individualized kind of reform that reinforces individual pathology. Right? It doesn't look at why it is a woman or man, black woman might be engaging in drug use, right? Because of the traumas that she's experienced, because of the institutional traumas that she's experiencing that are exacerbated by the forms of state violence that she experiences, right? It's focusing on her individual pathologies without a broader structural analysis. That's not to say that this isn't a good step. So it's kind of complicated, right? So this is good. It's better than the hellholes that women are incarcerated in today if they're diverted out or they're given treatment. But at the same time, it's reinforcing their individual pathologies. And it also enables broader state surveillance. So there's been a lot of writing about drug courts and others that basically describes the way in which these forms of supervision extend state intrusion into the lives of poor people of color beyond what might have been a custodial sentence, right? So, and into other parts of their lives that might have otherwise been beyond the reach of like parole or probation. So in some ways, I see it as, to the extent that it links up with a system of criminal justice and mass incarceration. I don't know if it can redeem any part of it, or if it just becomes so degraded by its association. And I'm probably in the latter camp.
I think so.
Yeah. I wish I had an answer that was as interesting as the question, which is, it's a great question. I mean, the one thing that I guess I would flag, which is, in a way a step or two removed, but I mean, Obamacare is really ambivalent about the question of the workplace basis for access to health care. Right? On the one hand, there's the employer mandate, which kind of is against the backdrop of the presumption that employers should provide health insurance, and it's completely consistent with the frame that's taken up by a lot on the left, which I think is very problematic, which is to say, if you're paying your workers so low that they have to go on welfare, God forbid, what an awful thing, something has gone awry when anyone gets a public benefit, right? Therefore, there's a problem with what the employer is doing, which really relies on the idea that the ideal economy is one in which people rely exclusively on their wages and employers, and if something has gone awry, when people get access to resources through the state. So I have a somewhat controversial view on that. And so Obamacare is ambivalent about that, because on the one hand, the Medicaid expansion part of it does expand, right, direct access to health care outside of employer relationship, but on other sides, it reinforces the employer connection in ways that, of course, and this is the connection to what I'm talking about, increase employer power, right? Because the more workers are dependent on their employers, either to get health care or to not go to jail, right? The more power employers have over them. So there, I think that ambivalence is really important, and I'm all for decommodification of an access to basic levels of necessities, in part because of the way in which they increase worker power relative to their employers.
Did you want to comment? Yeah, I just have a quick thought about that. So it's a reminder about the nature of Obamacare being about squarely in the camp of being part of a neoliberal state, right, in the way that it's constructed entirely. And we should not forget that, the option to have single payer, was really what I think served the purposes that you talk about here. And in the absence of that, we're not only beholden to the employer, we're beholden to the drug companies and the insurance companies in a way that I think is probably even more exacerbated, right? So it is still a neoliberal project, but it kind of reminds me of an option that we had with respect to child care in the 1970s, right? There was at one point where we had an opportunity to have nationalized child care, which might have eradicated some of the problems and addressed some of the deficiencies in ability to work, right? Which is, which undercuts the whole program to begin with. And President Nixon vetoed it, suggesting that it would commit the vast moral authority of the national government to the side of communal approaches, right? I.e. socialism, right? And you hear a lot of that with Obamacare as well. And so it pays to really pay attention to history, because I think we have some of the same problems now.
I think we maybe have time for one more question if we have one. Yeah.
I just wanted to see, I should have said this before, right at the end of the question, when I didn't want to know. Though, which I think is captured beautifully in the point you just made about the neoliberal state. Obamacare is not when viewed from 40,000 feet, a public good. Healthcare in Canada is a public good. Healthcare in Britain, France, Scandinavia is a public good. Obamacare is in a very small way a public good, but it's really utilizing on the neoliberal paradigm, the forces of the market, to deal with what other advanced industrial societies, every other one,
Yes.
have decided should be dealt with by the state. So I think before you even ask the question, that's the first thing that you have to recognize. But I think the neoliberal point needs to say.
Anybody want to comment on that? Okay. Since we had no comments from the panel on the
just a really
ostensibly
quick
final question.
Plug, because Camille told me to do it earlier and I forgot. Again, I'm with California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. We do community education, community informed research, all for the good of changing policy. So I want to thank the panel. I think if we're going to reframe, we just have to do the damn thing. So our way of doing that is to just remind folks that we completely stand for individual self-determination, and no one should tell any woman what size her family should be. No one should tell any woman when she can or can't have any children, and yet we do all the time. Because this country, if you want to know what a country thinks about its people, you look at its laws, right? And our laws, when you look at how laws constantly penalize poor folks, it answers itself. And so on that, I just want to thank you for your panel. We passed these around earlier. We have a little more information. One of the many things we're working on currently is to repeal the maximum family grant rule. And this is so important because for 2 decades, we've told poor women, no, you can't have another child, no, you can't have another child, and you're going to be penalized for the small amount of social services that you receive in that regard anyway. So we have that, this is what the little flyer was. We have a lot of them, especially if you're teaching on campus and you'd like more information, please see myself or Susie. We would love to give you some more information on that. And I want to thank Camille for letting us, really plug this, because I think it's really easy to go home and just be so upset about all this, like this. But then be reminded that we have power in changing something, and Governor Brown needs to be told what to do because he's so not on it. So, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much to the panel, and thank you for the questions. All right.